Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Nneka D and Kristin Moriah on the many legacies of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Derrick Spires, and I serve on the Society's council. I am joining you from the University of Delaware, which occupies lands vital to the web of life for Lenape and Nanticoke, who share their ancestry, history, and future in this region. UD has financially benefited from this regional occupation, as well as from indigenous territories that were expropriated through the United States land grant system. As a national research library, the American Antiquarian Society's mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded through primary sources like those in our vast pre-1900 collections, including newspapers, books, engravings, diaries, political cartoons, materials written by and for children, and much more. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and supportive scholarship. We welcome researchers from around the world and from Worcester to use the collections, both physical and digital. And we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. This program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of all our programs on our YouTube channel. Just go to our website, americanantiquarian.org, and then go to programs and events to find recordings of our past programs. Today's program will begin with presentations from each speaker, followed by a short colloquy between them. We will have time for your questions later in the program. You can post them in the Q&A form at the bottom of your screen at any time. Lauren Havalis, program coordinator, will be putting relevant information into the chat during this program. And please know that as a private, nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep our work going. And thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Nneka D. Denny is assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University. Denny co-founded the Black Women's Studies Association. Her first book, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th Century Black Radical Feminist, was published by Oxford University Press in 2023 as part of their New Histories of Philosophy series. In 2024, Denny was one of 10 recipients nationwide of the Mellon Emerging Faculty Leaders Award from the Institute of Citizens and Scholars. Her work has been supported by the Center for Black Digital Research at Pennsylvania State University, as well as a consortium for faculty diversity postdoctoral fellowship at Davidson College and the MIT School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences Diversity Predoctoral Fellowship. Denny's work has been published in Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, Feminist Studies, Atlantic Studies, Global Currents, Slate, and more. Our second speaker, Kristin Moriah, is an associate professor of English at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She is the editor of Insensible of Boundaries, Studies in Mary Ann Shadd Cary, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2024, the first volume of scholarly essays about Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and the first volume published in the Black Print and Organizing in the Long 19th Century series. In 2022, she was a visiting fellow at the Pennsylvania State University Center for Black Digital Research and the Pennsylvania State Humanities Institute. She is the most recent recipient of the American Studies Association Yasu Sakakibara Prize and one of the inaugural recipients of the Queen's University Black Scholars Excellence in Mentorship Award. Her writing can be found in American Quarterly, C Magazine, and PAJ, a journal of performance and art, theater research in Canada. Now, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Professor Denny. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Spires, for your introduction. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, if you'll give me just a second to pull everything up for you. All right. My book is titled Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th Century Black Radical Feminist. And I want to start with the cover because I absolutely adore it. This is artwork that was commissioned for an artist named by, or rather, by the Toronto History Museums. And it's by an artist named Young Yemi. And he's an Afrofuturist Canadian artist who put together this portrait of Shadd Cary a few years ago. And immediately when I saw it, I knew that this had to be my book cover. There are a couple features on the book cover that are selected, or rather in the portrait, that reflect different moments in Shadd Cary's life that I want to call your attention to. So you'll notice some of the flowers, for instance. Those are the state flowers of Delaware and Pennsylvania, two states where she spent some time in her childhood. And there are additional features sprinkled throughout, like the asterisks that are in gold towards the bottom of the portrait, because she sometimes signed her name with an asterisk rather than actually using her full name, Ann Shadd Cary. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those features for you before we dive into some of the work that I aim to accomplish with the book. I'll begin with a brief overview of who Ann Shadd Cary was. She was an early Black feminist thinker who was the first Black woman newspaper editor in North America. She would also become the first Black woman to enroll in law school in the United States. She was a lot of different firsts throughout her career in a really fascinating way. She was also a jack of all trades. I don't know how she had the time to be an abolitionist and a suffragist and a teacher and a lawyer and a lecturer and a writer and an editor, but nevertheless, she was all of these things and more. Ann Shadd Cary was born in 1823 to free parents in Delaware, and she would eventually become one of the most prominent proponents of emigration, the idea that African Americans should leave the United States rather than remaining and dealing with the persistence of slavery in the country, particularly in light of the Fugitive Slave Act. I'd like to highlight as well what exactly my book entails. It's a collection of various primary sources by and about Shadd Cary, namely letters, editorials, newspaper articles, speeches, organizational records, and some never before published handwritten notes and essay drafts. I published this book and it came out in 2023. Which was the 200-year anniversary of Shadd Cary's birth. So it offered a really exciting moment at that point in time to be able to engage in some of the work that was being done around Shadd Cary more broadly, partially in relation to the Colored Conventions Project and work that was being done for Douglass Day at Penn State. Primary source readers of this nature are really important works of historical recovery. They help us to understand the breadth of a thinker's work and not simply the limited scope that we might sometimes associate Shadd Cary with. I say sometimes limited scope because many people hear her name and they think of her newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. However, she was working on several other things over the course of at least, I would say, 6 decades. And so sometimes when we think about the Provincial Freeman, we're only focused on this limited time period during the 1850s. So instead, this book project helps us to have a more expansive view of Shadd Cary. There have also been very few works about Shadd Cary in the past 30 years. Jane Rhodes' biography of Shadd Cary, which was published in 1998, remains the only single-authored book that examines her work. Meanwhile, we've got dozens, if not hundreds, of books about some other prominent Black abolitionists and some other figures during the 19th century who were important to the trajectory of American history. So this was really an opportunity to help you to use the anniversary to help recover some of Shadd Cary's work and hopefully inspire other scholars to do additional research into Shadd Cary while making their lives a little bit easier, considering that her archives are spread out all over the place. I can talk about this a little bit more later, particularly during the Q&A, but suffice to say that Shadd Cary's archives are not in a single collection. She has some papers, for instance, that are at the Archives of Ontario in Canada. She also has some work that's at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center in DC at Howard University. And so the nature of her archives means that scholars don't have one single place to go to, which complicates the kinds of work that we're able to do around Shadd Cary. I also wanted to do this project in order to help reframe how we think about Black women's and Black radical intellectual labor. Shadd Cary was indeed an editor, but she was also a thinker, and a Black radical thinker at that, which is one of the central arguments that I make in the book. I'm aiming to insert Shadd Cary into this longer history of Black radicalism and Black feminism as well, in part to help us reconsider the kinds of lenses that filter the ways that we see Black women and how we interpret their work. For the next few minutes, I'd like to highlight some of the central themes that appear in Shadd Cary's work and some snapshots from her life. As I previously mentioned, she was an advocate for African Americans to go to Canada, and she herself emigrated in 1851. She would found the Provincial Freeman newspaper shortly thereafter and returned to the US in 1863 at the height of the Civil War, at which point she would begin recruiting soldiers to the Union Army, Black soldiers to be more specific, something that she did at the request of Martin Delany. There are several key themes that appear in Shadd Cary's work from the 1850s onward. But suffice to say that some of the main things that we see appearing are her discourse on women's rights, transnationalism, and economic self-determination. I've got a picture here of one of my favorite pieces from Shadd Cary called Meetings at Philadelphia. So this is a piece that she publishes shortly after the Dred Scott decision. You might be familiar with the famous quote, that Black people have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. This is part of what she's responding to with this piece. She has a lot of one-liners throughout her career, and some of my favorite ones appear in Meetings at Philadelphia. She notes, do the Purvises, Remans, and others who took part in the meeting intend to stay in the United States? As she's criticizing this interracial gathering for having passed resolutions that in her view were not strong enough. So she continues, if so, the resolutions amount to nothing. If not, why not say so, friends? Your national ship is rotten, sinking. Why not leave it? And why not say so boldly, manfully? Shadd Cary in this piece, if we look a few lines further down on that second image, she also notes that people should, quote, leave that slavery-cursed republic. So you can tell that she was really adamant that action needed to be coupled, or rather that statements and criticism and talking needed to be coupled with action. And if we skip down to the final line, you'll note as well that she says that we hope, however, that they too will look at facts instead of everlastingly theorizing. So this is a really central point that continues to emerge throughout her work, that people should do more and talk less. I want to highlight as well a few snapshots of how Shadd Cary talks about transnationalism and why it was important for African Americans to leave the United States. Shadd Cary published her landmark pamphlet, A Plea for Emigration, in 1852. With this piece, she goes into a lot of detail about some of the practical and tangible considerations that are involved with emigration, like the quality of the soil, for instance, what kinds of crops you can grow. But once we get through some of those tangible things, she's also making arguments about how transnationalism and emigration are inherently abolitionist strategies. For Shadd Cary, transnationalism would allow African Americans to prevent the expansion of slavery into other territories. So she notes, for instance, that in no more effectual way could a check be given to the encroachments of slavery on free soil. She argues as well in A Plea for Emigration that African Americans should go to the British West Indies in order to join forces with the free Black people who were in that region. She continues to explain that an extensive emigration by the free colored people of the United States would affect the institution of slavery. In Shadd Cary's view, this migration would allow Black people to experience and to enjoy economic self-determination, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. And in turn, this is something that, in her view, would better allow them to provide aid to fugitives from slavery. She continues to note, even after the publication of this piece, that the colored man's increase of character, wealth, influence, education, etc. in Canada where his manhood would be recognized, would afford opportunities to aid enslaved people to a far greater extent than could be done under present circumstances. And she also says that she maintains that by emigration, they would be enabled to do anti-slavery work more effectually. So for Shadd Cary, there are a couple different ideas wrapped up in transnationalism. It's not only about offering Black people freedom from slavery, but also about the ways that it could influence their abolitionist work. As I mentioned, Shadd Cary talks quite a bit about economic self-determination in many of her pieces. And this is something that we see coming up really prominently during Reconstruction. She publishes a pair of newspapers in 1871 in one of Frederick Douglass's many newspapers, the New National Era. So she's got Letters to the People, #1 and #2. What I've got here is #2. And so some of the claims that she makes in both of these pieces are that Black people should utilize their buying power. Black people should go to Black-owned businesses. Women should be empowered to vote. She writes in probably the first piece, I don't think it's in this exact one, but she writes that the boys must have trades. So she is really focused on labor discrimination as well. That's some of what she discusses in this piece, the ways that Black people are essentially having to work on inferior materials in order to produce the same products, and then they're not being compensated appropriately. If you take a look at the clip from the middle, she notes, demand that a portion of patronage come to your shops from both white men and colored, else withdraw your patronage from the corner grocery and let it keep itself. So she's really intentional here about what exactly it means to choose where you are spending your money and how this could have an impact on race relations and Black people's rights more broadly. She continues, still in that same section, give to colored tradesmen at least the favor you bestow upon an Irishman, an after-the-war Republican, or a rebel, all of whom make all they can out of you and scheme to keep your boys working, in turn to support their boys. So she's really attentive to class dynamics across racial lines. And this is one of the features of her work that hasn't received quite so much attention because there is a lot of attention on her work with the Provincial Freeman, which is significant, no doubt. But we also see that 20 years later, she's developed some of these early economic ideas that she experimented with in relation to emigration in order to think about what Black people's labor means and what Black laborers need more broadly. I also really enjoy how she concludes this particular piece, where she notes in her final line, proclaim a policy and stick to it like grim death. You can see from this piece, you can see from meetings at Philadelphia, that Shadd Cary was very insistent, almost militant, in fact, with how she wanted Black people to, and their comrades, right? She's also talking about interracial groups of activists. She's very intentional about framing how she wants them to intervene and to advocate for Black people's freedom. The final point that I would like to highlight, or the final theme, has to do with Shadd Cary's work around women's rights. Shadd Cary focuses in much of her early work with the Provincial Freeman on establishing that Black women do in fact have a right to be involved in racial uplift efforts and that they should be writers and editors. So she notes, for instance, in an 1855 piece titled Adieu, where she's stepping down from serving as editor of the Provincial Freeman due to some of the challenges that she had experienced. She notes in this piece that she had received unfavorable treatment, and she specifically attributes this to her gender. She also says in that piece, we have broken the editorial ice, as she's encouraging other Black women to go to writing, go to editing as soon as you can if you think you are able. Shadd Cary, throughout her career, would also advocate for women's suffrage, some of which we see with this piece here. It's undated, but this is another one of my favorite Shadd Cary one-liners. This is a piece called, Would Women's Suffrage Have a Tendency to Elevate the Moral Tone of Politics? The very first point that she notes in this list is, drunken women were not at the polls. She would then continue later on to say that women vote for principles, but men vote for money, right? So she's highlighting how women might be able to have a moralizing influence on politics and on the public sphere, arguments that we would also see reiterated later on with figures like Anna Julia Cooper, for instance. Shadd Cary was also attentive to women's labor in particular. She authored, alongside 3 or 4 other people, a report on women's labor for the Colored National Labor Convention in 1869. And in so doing, she talks about many of the restrictions or difficulties that Black women encounter, where they're doing domestic work or other forms of menial labor, and don't have access to enter the workforce in different kinds of roles as well. So these 3 things, economic self-determination, transnationalism, and women's rights, were really significant interventions that Shadd Cary offers to how we think about the 19th century, and particularly how we think about Black women and Black radicalism during the 19th century. To conclude, I would just like to call our attention finally to Ashley Farmer's work around the disorderly distribution of archival materials. This is a lengthy quote that I will not read in its entirety, but suffice to say that Farmer coins this concept in order to highlight how the disorderly distribution, she calls it, of certain women's materials and certain women's archives prevents us from seeing them as Black radicals. Farmer notes that it makes it difficult to interpret these women if they appear to be, quote, incongruous, incomplete, or enigmatic figures because their lives and thoughts are not neatly collected and processed in manuscript collections. Now, this is certainly a phenomenon that occurs with Shadd Cary in particular. And so part of what I've aimed to do with this book is to disrupt the disorderly distribution of Shadd Cary's work as well as its effects, so that we can understand her in its entirety, by grappling with her archive, focusing not simply on different fragments, but focusing on the broader threads that emerge throughout her work. I just want to end with sharing this discount code, which I believe you'll also be able to find in the chat or in a follow-up email. If you are interested in purchasing the book, you can visit tinyurl.com/Mary Ann Shadd Cary book, and you will receive 30% off using the code AAFlyG6. Thank you so much for your time, and I would now like to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Kristin Moriah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Denny. That was fantastic. And thank you to everybody for coming out tonight and for all of the staff at AAS for helping to coordinate all of this. And so today my talk is a little bit informal, sort of ish for an English professor, but it's inspired by the multidisciplinary approach to Shadd Cary that's really encapsulated in this new volume, Insensible of Boundaries. And so the title of my talk is Our Queer Cousin M, The Strange Thing About Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And the title is a nod to an article written by William J. Wilson, also known as the Ethiop. A frequent contributor to the North Star, Wilson has also been credited as a contributing writer for the opening speech of the famed 1855 Colored Convention in Philadelphia. In a piece entitled My Dear Cousin M, published in the North Star on November 9th, 1855, Wilson described some of the events of the 1855 Colored Convention and focuses very specifically on Mary Ann Shadd Cary, a daughter of Pennsylvania, her speech and appearance. Wilson explains that Miss Shadd is rather tall, but of fine physical organization, wholly feminine in appearance and demeanor, has a well-molded head set upon a rather slender neck, which gives her, when erect or speaking animatedly, what white folks might say is a very saucy look. An anecdote of her will best illustrate this. In New York and coming down Broadway, at a time when colored women scarcely dared to think of riding the stages, Miss Shadd threw up her head, gave one look and a wave of her hand. There was such an air of impressive command that the huge, coarse, ruffianly driver, who had been known to refuse colored ladies as though suddenly seized with paralysis, reined up to the curb, and she entered, and without hindrance rode to the end of her journey. Wilson goes on to note that Miss Shadd's eyes are small and penetrating, and fairly flash when she is speaking. Her eyes seem to flow so fast that at times she hesitates for words. Yet she overcomes any apparent imperfection in her speaking by the earnestness of her manner and the quality of her thoughts. She is a superior woman, and it is useless to deny it, however much we may differ with her on the subject of emigration. She obtained the floor, proceeded to, and succeeded in making one of the most convincing and telling speeches in favor of Canadian immigration I have ever heard. She at first had 10 minutes granted her, as had the other members. At their expiration, 10 more were granted, and by this time came the hour of adjournment. But so interested was the House that it granted additional time to her to finish, at the commencement of the afternoon session, and the House was crowded and breathless in its attention to her masterly exposition of our present condition. And the advantages Canada opens to colored men of enterprise. Herein consisted the charm and potency of her speech. So I promise that I'll stick to 10 minutes today. But I do love this description of Ann Shadd Cary, particularly the image of her hailing a stagecoach in Manhattan, because it speaks to her dynamism and the obstacles she faced on a quotidian basis as she pursued her activist agenda. It is thanks to journalists like Wilson that we have a sense of what Shadd Cary was like in person and how truly formidable she was. Today, I also posit that Wilson's description hints at the way that Canada allowed Shadd Cary to express a form of queer Black feminist activism, and I will try to elucidate. In evoking the term queer here, I deliberately reference E. Patrick Johnson's etymology of the term queer, as in meaning queer, also opposite of straight, odd, or slightly off kilter, from the African American vernacular for queer, sometimes homophobic in usage, but always denotes excess and capable of being contained within conventional categories of being. And also one who thinks and feels and sometimes acts up, committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc., or one for whom sexual and gender identities always already intersect with racial subjectivity. I argue that Ann Shadd Cary's steadfast refusal to be bound by conventional gender norms and her keen ability to use loopholes to evade gender discrimination make her a queer Black feminist figure. And all of this is to say nothing of the queer relationships she maintained. For example, her biographer Jane Rose reminds us that Ann Shadd Cary and her husband Thomas Cary maintained separate households and in fact never lived together for an extended period of time, despite having 2 children. This reluctance to cohabitate is even more striking when we consider the emphasis on domesticity that we find in Ann Shadd Cary's newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. Shadd Cary's contentious relationship with the cult of domesticity is taken up by scholars Ji-Won Wu, R.J. Boutelle, and Marlos Whitley in my new volume, Insensible of Boundaries, Studies in Ann Shadd Cary. My queer understanding of Ann Shadd Cary is also driven by Jose Munoz's, and by extension Elizabeth McHenry's, theorization of queer failure as an important analytic concept. Munoz understands queerness as a forward-looking mode of critique that can allow outsiders to revel in the margins. His definition of queer failure as a rejection of normative protocols of canonization and value speaks directly to the position of Ann Shadd Cary within the 19th century literary world. And here, queer failure is a brilliant offness, but it's not so much a failure to succeed as it is a failure to participate in a system of evaluation that is predicated on exploitation and conformity. Sometimes in her chosen field, Ann Shadd Cary failed spectacularly, but she remained undeterred. Describing her first pamphlet, Hints of Colored People to the North, a correspondent for the North Star reported that very little money had been paid for it, and that some readers said that had they known that the work contained some of the things which it does, they would not have had it as a gift. Thankfully, she insisted on the right to be heard in person as well as in print. We know that the criticism she faced took particular issue with her willingness to transgress gender boundaries. Throughout her life, Ann Shadd Cary occupied the outer limits of nationhood and gender. She was not invested in the respectability politics that were so important to Black male political leaders during the period, and she paid a price for it. But what do her gender politics have to do with space and nationhood? In a practical sense, as one of the few Black feminist speakers in antebellum Black political life, Ann Shadd Cary frequently crossed the US-Canadian border to give lectures. And her listeners were not equally pleased. Carla Peterson notes that Shadd Cary's speeches were often perceived not only as pertinent but impertinent, and that her unfeminine speaking style led even those who appreciated the substance of her lectures to admit her lack of eloquence, to label her delivery as nervous and hurried. Her insistence on the right to be heard in public courted controversy. And Jane Rhodes explains that while Black Americans seem to encourage and even require women's participation in the public sphere as necessary for racial progress during the antebellum period, Black women were expected to adhere to the cult of domesticity. And yet, while speaking out on stage and in the pages of the Provincial Freeman, Shadd Cary was no angel of the house. She consistently ran afoul of gendered expectations, which insisted upon Black women's silence, subservience, and respectability. Her literary pursuits certainly put her at odds with 19th century gender norms. In contrast to the rampant sexism of North American public discourse, the early issues of the Provincial Freeman established the paper as a forum for Shadd's growing interest in women's rights, especially within the context of anti-slavery and other reform movements, according to Jane Rhodes. Bouncing between cities like Windsor, Chatham, and Toronto, Ontario in the Provincial Freeman, Shadd Cary frequently reprinted material by feminist abolitionists, including a speech by Harriet Beecher Stowe, an appeal to women of the free states of America on the present crisis of our country. Unlike her famed plea for immigration, Shadd Cary's newspaper contained an early assemblage of Black feminist discourse that was intersectional and drew few cultural distinctions between Canada and the United States. And of course, it was the first newspaper to be published by a woman in North America. I'm only being a little bit facetious when I say that Ann Shadd Cary's willingness to transgress gender boundaries, transgress boundaries and subvert gender expectations are queer. The US-Canadian border is a 5,525-mile long figurative line that has meant very real freedom for some, for the fugitives who fled slavery before the Civil War and the refugees seeking asylum there today. Theorizing the US-Mexico border, Gloria Anzaldúa writes that borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. But the US-Canadian border often fails at that task. My colleague Catherine McKittrick has shown that for Black Canadians, such nation borders are called into question because they do not sufficiently speak to the ways in which Black geographies in Canada are made and upheld. Inhabitants of these borderlands often have a pragmatic approach to citizenship and nationhood. When I consider Ann Shadd Cary's relationship to the liminal states of the US-Canadian border and Canada itself, I'm struck by the way that her pragmatism also extended to gender and sexuality. And I don't mean to say that Ann Shadd Cary understood herself as queer in a practical or political sense in any one given moment during her lifetime. But in a very contemporary sense, she certainly was. And right now, we have the privilege of hindsight and contemporary discourse and archival materials to allow us to understand her as such and to discover her in new ways. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professors Moriah and Dennie for those wonderful presentations. I hope you're applauding out there in Zoom world. Expect you can also put your applause in chat. You can type out applause if you like, use an emoji, whatever floats your boat in this evening time. Please, I'll remind you that you're welcome to add questions into the Q&A section on Zoom. It's at the bottom of your screen next to the share button. I see a few questions populating already, and we'll transition into the segment of the program where we ask our presenters to speak to each other a little bit. And I'll pose the first question because it's rather fortuitous that we have two great books about Ann Shadd Cary emerging within a year of each other, quickly after her 200th anniversary in 2023 and the reissue of Jane Rhodes's biography of Shadd Cary. And so I'd ask both of you to reflect a little bit after having engaged with each other's work a little bit. What have you learned from each other and the general renewed, I think, Kristin, you described it as a Renaissance moment, the general zeitgeist in Mary Ann Shadd Cary world and scholarship?
Yeah, I apologize. I had in fact just come from a Beyonce concert, I'm sure, when I when I wrote that line. So
You and everybody else, it seems.
I know it might not age very well, but I'm thinking of that, and also the first question in the chat. I'm thinking about Mary Ann Shadd Cary alongside the sort of mid-century literary contemporaries. Um, Perhaps like people like Emily Dickinson, but this is such a unique moment, as Derrick has noted. In fact, her collections really haven't necessarily been mastered by men at all. Nneka D is the first person to come out with an edited collection of her work, right? This selected set of works by Mary Ann Shadd Cary is the first time this has appeared in the world. And so, in fact, we're quite lucky in some ways that we live in this moment and that all of this is happening, right? That I'm working alongside Nneka while she's working on this collection, that we have scholars who are writing for insensible of boundaries and who are thinking about ways in which to carry forth their own disciplinary orientation, right, to her primary sources and to thinking about her life. It's never actually happened before in quite the same way, I would say. We absolutely have other Black feminists who have been writing about her and who have been trying to push this moment forward. And they're the reason that Nneka and I are here, absolutely. But we've never really quite seen this in terms of her scholarship about Mary Ann Shadd Cary, I would say.
Yeah, I would also add that in response to your question, Dr. Spires, about learning from one another, I have been so fortunate to be able to think through Shadd Cary alongside someone who speaks the same language, right? I know that when I'm speaking with Dr. Moriah, she understands what I'm talking about, and I understand what she's talking about because we've both studied Shadd Cary deeply. And it's so rewarding to be able to be an intellectual community with one another. We overlapped slightly with the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State. And at that time, we were talking about documents, we were talking about digital research methods in ways that were really helpful and really instructive. I think also just for me personally, being in that incubator space allowed me to realize that I can and should be a lot more strategic with how I'm treating my primary sources as data and cataloging things and keeping track of things. So in a practical sense, that's one thing that was really valuable. And I'll also note that Dr. Moriah's work has inspired me to pay a bit more attention to Shadd Cary's personal life as well. Much of my work prior to spending some time thinking through Shadd Cary alongside Dr. Moriah and others was really focused on what she put on the page in some way, shape, or form for the public, and not as much on some of these more private dimensions. So that was something as well that influenced how I approached the book.
Thank you both for that. I have some other questions, but since both chat and Q&A boxes are popping, I'm going to shift gears and ask some of those questions because they align with some of the things that we've been talking about already. And I'll combine a couple of questions, one from Jennifer and another from Nazira. She's really thinking about Mary Ann Shadd Cary in dialogue, right? Thinking about her as a philosopher, someone who sort of talked politics, engaged in rhetorical battle with folks like Mary Elizabeth Miles Bibb, Henry Highland Garnett, and others. And so they both ask a version of the question which is, can you help us think about Mary Ann Shadd Cary as an intellectual interlocutor with other Black intellectuals, other Black philosophers, especially Black women? Were they engaging in the pages of the Provincial Freeman, for instance? Is there evidence that Mary Ann Shadd Cary engaged directly with someone like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper?
Yeah, I'd like to start since you mentioned Harper. One of the things that did not make it into the book is a letter from Shadd Cary where she notes that Frances Harper will be speaking soon. And she also says, I don't want to speak at that event because I know she's going to be amazing and I don't want her to show me up. And I was just really amused finding that just on a human level. But also, Shadd Cary repeatedly published some of Harper's work, as well as favorable reviews of Harper's work in the Provincial Freeman. So she notes, for instance, and she includes some pieces from William Still, where he's giving positive reviews of Harper's work. It's a little bit difficult to trace Black women's voices in the Provincial Freeman, in part because not as many women appear. And when women do appear, I'm not entirely convinced that it's not simply Shadd Cary herself writing under a pseudonym. So for instance, there's a back and forth between someone named Dolly Bangs, as well as I think a Henrietta W. Again, both of these people, neither of these people could or could not be Shadd Cary. But one of them writes a letter to the editor of the Provincial Freeman and says, hey, are women allowed to publish in this newspaper? And the response is then, of course, women can publish in this newspaper. We're not entirely sure who wrote those because it is known that Shadd Cary sometimes took steps to obscure her identity. But that being said, she, at the very least, was in favor of platforming and publishing other women.
Nneka, I love the fact that you bring that up because, she was just doing the most in terms of the Provincial Freeman at all times. But this question brings to mind two things, I think, on a very practical level. Thinking about her support for Frances W. Harper also reminds me of her support for very public figures and artistic figures like Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. And there's a sense in which Shadd Cary was really at the forefront of defending this, iconoclastic Black opera singer in a way that wasn't really common for the press at the time. I mean, she did it for a long time, actually, long after the controversy about Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield performing in segregated spaces had passed. Mary Ann Shadd Cary actually kept promoting her and kept working with her in a really practical way. In another sense, I am always struck by this one article that I remember in the Provincial Freeman about the importance of Black settlers in Southern Ontario educating their daughters. And it's a really short piece, and it's written for Black men. And it says, remember to educate your daughters. You have this space, you have this freedom, you have this time, and it's really important to do this now. And I think about that moment as a moment in which she is also paying it forward and really trying to foster and continue the intellectual tradition that she was developing on the pages of the Provincial Freeman.
So many thoughts on this. One, Nneka, your commentary on Shadd's response to Harper reminds me of somebody talking about Aretha Franklin. Like, I'm just not. Aretha is Aretha, Whitney is Whitney. I'm not going to touch that. Kind of respect going on there. And Kristin, your commentary on literacy really dovetails into one of the questions in the Q&A, which is about education. And maybe we can use that as a way of talking more broadly about the Shadd family. Right, because that family runs so deep, right? So what were the sort of educational opportunities for Mary Ann Shadd from Delaware to Westchester and to Toronto? And could both of you talk a little bit more about her as an educator? She is a woman who wore many hats.
Nneka, you went first last time, so I'm happy to jump in. I think that one of the things that is so significant about Shadd Cary and that clearly contributed to her as this outspoken public figure is her family's emphasis on education for girls and women. And so, there is the way in which they actually move from state to state in order to make sure that their daughters are fully educated and their daughters are not barred from education. And Shadd Cary also goes on to become a teacher. And that is one of the ways in which she's able to make a living when she first moves to Southern Ontario as a teacher. And she, in typical Shadd Cary fashion, dives into political debates around education in Southern Ontario. I, wish that I could say that I agreed with her takes at that time, but in some senses, it actually doesn't matter, right? To me, what is significant about her is that she sees herself as this figure who will be a catalyst for social change. And being in the classroom and educating her community is actually an integral part of that work.
Yeah, and just as a little bit of additional background, Shadd Cary herself was educated. She did go to school as a child, and that's actually part of the reason why her family would move from Delaware to Pennsylvania. And she went to a Quaker school in her youth. And so these are some features, as well as the work that her family is doing on the Underground Railroad, for instance, with her father, Abraham Shadd, also being part of the Colored Conventions movement, that offers her a strong grounding, not just in literacy, but in the practical education of what it means to be an activist in this era and what it means to fight for Black people's freedom.
Yeah, and continuing the line of thought, I'm thinking about Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a kind of public intellectual, somebody whose thinking evolves over time, right? She is very outspoken in her opinions, and she's not terribly interested in being agreed with. Right. One of my favorite Shadd Cary pieces is about the demagogues in the churches and telling people you can listen to those demagogues if you want, or you can educate yourself. Right. That dovetails with the question from Douglas Jones in the Q&A box. And Nneka, you referred to Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a Black feminist and radical. Kristin, you referred to Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a queer intellectual. Jones wants us to think through the meaning of those concepts, right? Sort of asking, can you reflect on the differences between the Black radical tradition and the Black liberal traditions in the 19th century Black thought vis-a-vis Mary Ann Shadd Cary? What does it mean to think of her as a radical in the context of a liberal politics in the 19th century and today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. To start with, I'm conceptualizing Black radicalism, broadly speaking, as having a few different, I would say three key features during this era. Recognizing multi-layered oppressions, critiquing anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and having a desire to realize change. I'm reminded as well of a comment that one of my students made a few years ago that fundamentally shifted how I was thinking about Black radicalism. I asked them, what is Black radicalism? And I had a first-year student whose response was, Black radicalism is things that really should not be. And so when I'm referring to Shadd Cary as a Black radical rather than a Black liberal, part of what I'm aiming to do is identify how she laid the foundation for different kinds of Black radical theories and strategies that we would later see emerging during the 20th century. I also want us to recognize that Black radicalism, of course, looks different at different points in time. So what we're thinking of as radical during the 20th century might not be radical during the 19th century. So she is, for instance, an integrationist, something that we might not think of as being radical, something that we might see as liberal. Nevertheless, she is a separatist in terms of her idea that we need to separate from the American nation state, right? She's also talking about labor really intentionally and really clearly in ways that I argue predate some of its later iterations. The way that she's advocating for Black people to leave the United States, for instance, I see that as being something that's predating later movements for repatriation. Not necessarily directly influencing Garvey, for instance, but still existing within that space and within that tradition in terms of the critiques that she's making. I also describe in the book how Black women's performance of the politics of respectability sometimes makes them couch their intellectual interventions in discourses around religion and domesticity and middle-class standards of womanhood that obscures how we see them as radicalism. I argue that their radicalism appears muted because of some of these racial and gender constraints. But once we get into the text, once we see their ideas, once we return to the sources, we see that the substance is there.
Nneka, that's a tough act to follow. But one of the things I will say is that this conversation reminds me, again, quite specifically of Ji-won Woo's chapter in Sensible of Boundaries, in which she really takes up a comparison between Mary Bibb, the wife of Henry Bibb, some of Mary Ann Shadd Cary's early supporters in Southern Ontario, and their different approaches to editing. And Ji-won makes the point that Mary Ann Shadd Cary actually believed that Mary Bibb was the editor, but she was so afraid of being public about her editorial practices, about her writerly ambitions, that she hid that right within the pages of Henry Bibb's newspaper. Whereas Mary Ann Shadd Cary was actually never afraid to hide her role and her political ambitions in public, her desire to be an editor, to be out front. And in some ways, I think that that constant tension between the very public role that Mary Ann Shadd Cary wanted to play in terms of Black politics and Black writing really speaks to how deeply radical her work was perceived during that time, right? It seems like she was rubbing the wrong people in the right ways, right? And so that tells me something.
I hope you wrote that down somewhere. I love that. She's rubbing the right people in the wrong ways. That's another book or something. You got to write that down, copyright it, trademark it, or something, please. Thank you. Um, we have a few questions in the Q&A box around archives. And so I think I'll collapse those into one larger question because Mary Ann Shadd Cary presents a challenge for a few reasons. One, is it the case that the absence of a Mary Ann Shadd Cary papers is a result of sort of historically racist collection practices, archival practices, and thinking, intersectionally as a Black woman, right? We can point to Douglass and others, but maybe not Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And also her travel can make her rather difficult to pin down, from Delaware to Westchester to Toronto to Detroit to DC region to all up and down the place. So she's a bit of an itinerant. She's fugitive in that way. So could you talk a little bit about, what it means to try to find Shadd Cary in the archives, and maybe some tips and thoughts for folks who are new to researching or old me to researching Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and thinking through papers, institutions, the people who work in those places, and all those little bits.
Sure, I can start. Well, first, I'm not certain. I would say that the diverse nature of Shadd Cary's archives is strictly because of racism, but I would not say that either, right? So we do know, for instance, that silences in the archives can be created by people deciding what they think is worth preserving and what they think is not. And with Shadd Cary, it hasn't been the case that her work has not been preserved, but rather that it's been preserved in so many different spaces. So I do think that racism, of course, influences any archives that we're working with, particularly when we're talking about Black people during the 19th century, Black women during the 19th century. But I'm not confident in saying that the dispersal of her archives is a result of racism. In terms of doing research on Shadd Cary, something that I found really valuable as I was working on this book were all of these different digital databases, Accessible Archives, which has since been renamed into something else, other archives or databases that are available online, like Gale's Slavery and Anti-Slavery, a Transnational Archive, were really helpful, in part because this was largely a pandemic project for me, and I felt like things were flowing really unexpectedly smoothly as I was working on it, because the wealth of her material was there, and using some digital research methods was really influential for being able to complete this project at a time, or at least get the bulk of the project done at a time when we couldn't do a lot of traveling, far less international traveling. Having materials that have been digitized has been monumental as well, with being able to do work on Shadd Cary for this project.
Yeah, this question calls to mind an interview that I recently conducted with Sean Smith, a head archivist at Archives Ontario, and Melissa Nelson, an assistant archivist at Archives Ontario, who's also been incredibly powerful as a driving force in terms of getting Archives Ontario to rethink their relationship to Black historical materials. And one of the things that I'm so excited about and proud of is that working with that Shadd Cary collection has actually helped Archives Ontario to reshape their approach to Black historic materials. And this is something that Sean Smith and Melissa talk about quite extensively. And so there's a way in which, we are actually just really at the beginning, at the forefront of rethinking Shadd Cary and some of our primary sources, but already the practical impact of that, and even thinking about Shadd Cary's impetus or desire to like do more and say less, has had a really very concrete impact on archival practices in major Canadian institutions. And that's really profound, right? It's because of this work with CBDR, it's because of the push for digitization that this new set of materials is now ensconced in Canada's national heritage by CC UNESCO. These kinds of things really could not have been imaginable, I think, even like 5 or 10 years ago.
And just want to take a moment to shout out again the Center for Black Digital Research that made Shadd Cary the focus of their Douglas Day Transcribathon a few years ago, supported symposia around her. Archives Ontario, which has made their collections publicly accessible, and UPenn, it's made their Provincial Freeman collections accessible. We have time for, knock out one more question broadly about Mary Ann Shadd Cary and other kinds of immigration projects. So one question is about Mary Ann Shadd Cary's ideas about the American Colonization Society. The other question is about her ideas around immigration to Haiti. I know both projects include meditations on Mary Ann Shadd Cary and Mexico. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary and immigration broadly conceived outside of Canada.
Uh, in my book, this is not a shameless plug, only a little bit of a plug.
No shame,
I
no shame.
mentioned, I include one of her articles that's specifically about Haitian colonization. So I love that you asked this, because she was really strongly opposed, really strongly opposed. One of the main reasons that she was opposed is because she saw this as essentially a corrupt attempt to get Black people out of the US by people who were not actually friends to Black people. So she says a lot about a man named James Redpath. And she essentially says, look, what are your abolitionist credentials? We can vouch for William Lloyd Garrison, but who are you and what are you doing, right? She basically says he's an agent of the Haitian government and he is not to be trusted. She does not only publish one article about Haitian colonization, but rather she publishes about 4 or 5 back to back. This is 1861, 1862, several weeks in a row. Regarding Liberia, perhaps Dr. Moriah could speak about this a little bit more. I can't say specifically what her perspectives were on the American Colonization Society, but in relation to Africa more broadly, Shadd Cary was opposed to African colonization. And she argues that it would put Black people at risk of becoming re-enslaved. She also is worried about things like disease, the quality of the land, religion. These are some of the factors that that fuel her opposition to African colonization.
Yes. I am not an expert on Shadd Cary's opinions on Liberia, and I wish I was. But this question really brings to mind Kristen Lee's chapter in Insensible Boundaries, in which she specifically takes up Mary Ann Shadd Cary's ambivalence towards immigration to Mexico, and how that can be contrasted with her enthusiasm for immigration to Canada, and in some senses the way in which she really bypasses the global south in terms of other places of migration. And so when we read A Plea for Emigration, There are many very specific reasons why Shadd Cary believes that Southern Ontario very specifically will be hospitable for Black fugitives from slavery. And that remains her focus in terms of the immigration debate, obviously for a very long time. But Kristin Lee says it all much better. So I encourage you to pick up Insensible of Boundaries.
Well, everybody, you now have 2 new books to buy if you haven't bought them already with discounts. Don't forget the discount links in the chat. That's all the time we have for tonight. Please join me for another round of applause, and you can put your applause in the chat if you like for Professors Moriah and Denny. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please join us for our next virtual program on Wednesday, February 27th at 2 p.m. for a program in our book talk series featuring Brian Cinch on his recent book, published by the author, Self-Publication in 19th Century African American Literature. These and many other programs are listed on our website where you can register in advance. All programs are free of charge. And on behalf of the American Antiquarian Society, thank you, thank you, thank you, and have a good evening.